Welcome to the Prepared School Psych podcast, where we focus on providing school psychologists with the knowledge and tools to support students effectively. Whether you're early in your career or a seasoned professional, this podcast is here to offer insights, strategies, and conversations that help you feel more confident in your role. I'm pleased to welcome back Dr. Amy Merenda, a licensed educational psychologist and a valued member of the Ponzer Learning Solutions team. Amy brings extensive experience in educational assessments, independent evaluations, and IEP consultations. Since earning her LEP licensure, she has expanded her work beyond the school setting, offering private assessments, executive functioning support, counseling, and more. She's also passionate about neurodiversity affirming practices and creating inclusive learning environments. Today, we'll be talking about the role of a licensed educational psychologist, about the transition from school psychology and what that looks like, the opportunities it can provide, and the lessons Amy has learned along the way. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and as always, welcome back, Amy.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be back.
Well, as you know, we love to ask about favorite TV shows and ways to relax, enjoy our time. But since this is now the fourth time you're on the show, I thought I'd change the question for you this time. Are there any good books you are reading, and I know you, or listening to right now?
Yes, you do. And I have two answers. One's like a professional answer, and then one is more of a fun personal answer. So my professional answer, I'm actually reading with my eyeballs. And it's the Neurodiversity Affirming Schools book that just came out. It's written by Emily Kircher Morris and Amanda Morin. And they are really big advocates about how to incorporate neurodiversity affirming practices into actual school settings. So that's pretty awesome. Their book just came out. So far, I'm loving it. And then my personal answer. So I love a good, they call them cozy mysteries, where it's nice. Somebody falls in love and then someone's murdered, but don't worry too much about that. We'll solve the murder. It's just very light, if you can be light with a murder. And the series I'm listening to right now is called the Bake Shop Mystery Series. And it's by Ellie Alexander. It's about this baker, and she has a bake shop, and then all these people get murdered in her town. And for some reason, no one thinks that's a sign to move out of the town. They still live there. Anyway, it's very fun. And there's a love story, and she's a baker. So there's recipes. It's just so fun. So that's my ear candy when I'm not doing work stuff.
I love that. Love that. And yes, everyone, I'm going to put both books that she is talking about into our show notes. So if anyone wants to understand more about neurodiversity affirming schools, as well as why maybe if every other person gets murdered in your town, maybe you should
Yeah.
think of moving. But maybe the bikery is so good.
Apparently it
say.
is. And I know that Jenny, you and I are in California, and this book series takes place in Northern California,
Okay.
way up by the Oregon border. And so it's fun, hearing them talk about places. So I'm oh, that's I know where that is. And so for anyone else that's in California, it might resonate with you a little bit. And maybe that's why they don't move when everybody gets murdered. I don't know.
I will say one of my favorite book series, I don't know if it was officially called that, but it was the Alphabet Murder series. And it
Yes.
was A is for alibi, B is for whatever. And
Yes.
yeah, there was some Central California, Southern California, but there was definitely that moment that we're driving down the 405. And I'm "Oh, I know where she's driving. Oh, I know that hotel." So I love books set in,
Me too.
areas that we understand. Yes.
Me too.
Well, today we are talking a little bit about your private practice ability in California. Just a little bit of context for our listeners. I know it's a little bit different in every state. In California, school psychologists can apply for a separate license to work outside of the school setting, as long as the evaluation, the consultation, or the direct service always needs to go back to being educationally relevant. So, what led you to pursue this ability to be an educational psychologist?
That's a really good question. And for me, it was a couple of different things kind of happening at the same time. One is I was pregnant with my son. So I was at the point where I was trying to think ahead, what will this really look like for me, being a full time school psychologist in the schools, because I was for 6 years. And you know how that is. You put a lot of time in, a lot of effort in. And I loved doing that. A lot of times my SLP and I would joke that we were the last cars in the parking lot, but we don't get an award for that. But we would still give each other an award, like, oh, we still did it. But that's what it required and became was a lot of time and a lot of work, which again, I loved to do that. But I tried to think about, is that really feasible and manageable now with this baby coming into my life? And so that was on my mind. And then at the same time, I was also becoming a little more nuanced and I think comfortable questioning things just within the system itself, not specific to my district necessarily, but just like the way it's set up for us as school psychologists. There are things that of course, we have to follow the law. And I'm not saying to not do that, but just things where I'd be like, well, why does it have to be that way? Why are we looking for these certain things? Why can't we speak about these other certain things? And I started to kind of question them and think about, is there a way that I can feel more effective, maybe not going up against some of these procedural things and still do what feels important to me, which is help kids. And so those two things were happening congruently. And it just kind of was a perfect storm of like, well, you know what? I had done my LEP exam a couple years before. So I had already done that part. For those of you that are unfamiliar, you go through like the application process, you take a big exam. If you pass that exam, then you pay some money and get your license. And I had already gone through that whole process. So this was just like an available option to me.
Okay.
And I chose to make that change. So when I came back from maternity leave, I only came back part-time for the rest of the year. And it was just a few months, and then after that, I said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go full-time, private practice and see what I can do. And yeah, I know we're going to talk more about that, but it was a lot of change. But again, I think it was such a perfect storm where I felt like, well, things are already different, right? My life is already different. My priorities have already changed. I'm already different just as a person. So adding this layer, yes, it's a lot, but there was really no better time because it was already all up in the air. So why not just really fine tune it to become something that worked better for me? So that's kind of what got me to this point.
Before we continue, school psychs, counselors, and behavior specialists, when it comes to supporting neurodivergent students, are your strategies truly neurodiversity affirming? The new Making the Switch webinar series from Blooming Brains Educational Psychology is designed to help you move beyond outdated methods and provide meaningful, research based support to neurodivergent students. This on demand 5-hour professional development series covers essential topics including writing counseling goals that lead to real progress, effective executive functioning strategies, neurodiversity affirming behavior supports and FBAs, and counseling techniques tailored for neurodivergent students. This isn't just another webinar, it's a practical, evidence based approach designed specifically for school based professionals. Access the full series today for only $99. You can learn more and register at bloomingbrains.org/webinar. That's bloomingbrains.org/webinar, or you can find the registration link in the show notes of this episode. And with that, let's jump back into our conversation. We've alluded a little bit already to some differences in regards to your role as a school psychologist and wanting to expand things. So, can you talk a little bit about some of those key differences between the role of a school psychologist and a licensed educational psychologist? Like, what additional opportunities or responsibilities did this kind of open up for you?
Sure. So, a big one that sticks out to me is our ability to do a private evaluation. So, you do not have to conduct an evaluation really for the sole purpose of is this child eligible for special education or not. As a licensed educational psychologist, we can use the DSM to provide a diagnosis. Now, again, keep in mind it should be within our scope as an educational practitioner, like things that we come across, a learning disorder, anxiety, things that impact that child's access to education. But we have this ability to speak outside of the school setting only. We can say, we see, we've all been in those IEPs where you're dancing around. Does the child have dyslexia, ADHD, insert disorder here? And in that role, that's not within our scope to say, yep, you've got ADHD, friend, or at least in California. And this opened that door up to say, no, yes, like you do. You have a profile that fits someone with ADHD. Here are some things you can try at home. So the private side opens up in terms of doing those assessments. Again, it's tied, you always want to tie it back to education, but it can be more relevant for that child's life rather than having the referral question be, are they eligible for special education or not? To me, that was a really big opportunity because I felt like I had more chances to say and do things that could be meaningful. Not that a school psychologist special education role is not meaningful. It's meaningful in that capacity. But I was ready for more capacity, right? I want to truly, give you some guidance for your life rather than just for that school setting. And that gave me the chance to do that. We also, in LEP land, we can provide different supports outside of school, like counseling services, maybe some executive functioning coaching support, things like that. Again, we always want to make sure that the child has some kind of impact in their educational setting, but we can provide that outside of school. And we all know there's a big need for mental health support for children, especially outside of the schools. I don't know who else I will speak for, but I know I talk to a lot of colleagues and they feel similarly. In school, I never really felt like I was doing as good of a job as I wanted in the counseling side. Of course, I always did the best I could do. Yes. But our time is limited. We also have 16 open assessment plans. We have to run to this SST. We only have access to kids for a certain number of hours in the day when they're at school. Things are so restricted in that sense. And that's just the nature of it. And there's a lot of pros to that too. When the school day's over, it's over. But outside of that, I felt like, okay, I can really dive into this counseling session. Also, people are paying to see you. So likely they want to be there.
Mhm.
And we've also been in those situations at school where this kid has counseling on his IEP and poor guy just does not, this is not his jam. He does not want to be here. I'm wasting his time. So you have these different opportunities that come because of the need, because of the desire, because of your ability of things that you can say and do. And those are some of the key differences that stick out to me. A lot of things are similar, right? We can still provide psychoeducational assessments for schools in the role of the school psychologist. And that's very comfortable. That's what we do. That's what we've always done. So that's always very similar. And I know later on we're going to talk about IEEs and theirs are similar and different. So we're going to get to those too. But so a lot of similarities, few key differences too.
I would love to go back to the private
Yeah.
evaluation. And like you mentioned, there's a sense when you're doing them as a private practitioner that you get to open up a little bit more beyond just are you eligible or not eligible.
Yeah.
I know as a school psychologist, we're always concerned about what do we write in the recommendations. It can't cost anyone anything. And,
Yes.
you know, how have the recommendations part of your reports kind of expanded knowing that you don't have some of those restrictions? Again, someone is typically coming to you
Yes.
and wanting to really figure out about their student. I would say for myself, because I also have my LEP, when I've had some of those instances, there's sometimes I work with families, they don't even want to share the report with the school. They just want recommendations for the home setting. Like
Mhm.
there's just this need of, can you just tell me how to help support my child? And I can write things that cost money and I can write
Yes.
things that a lot of times people all will follow up. They'll call me 6 weeks later and say, all right, this really worked, but I'm not quite sure what to do next. And so I'm kind of curious, how have you seen the recommendations part of your report expand?
That's a fabulous question. I just was working on a report for a private client a couple days ago. And I don't know if that's happened to anybody, but as I type, sometimes I like narrate it in my head, like what I'm going to be saying. And I could like hear myself talking about it. And I heard myself do what a school psychologist would do. Oh, I can't say that, right? I can't type that in because that will imply that they need to go. But then I stopped myself and I was like, yes, I can. I can say that. And so one of the things that I did in this recommendation section of this report that was new for me And I did with hesitation. I have to be honest because I was a school psychologist. So I also know how it feels to sometimes read some of these reports. And I'm like, what is that recommendation? In the school setting, I have all these judgments. Well, in this particular case, the parent had tried to get a school evaluation. They came into a lot of challenges doing that, had, requested it in writing several times, and they were frustrated, for lack of a better word, about that experience. And so I felt strongly that in my recommendations, I could and should write in there that this child should have a school based evaluation. And I did. And of course, for anyone that may be reading that report, I tried to be very kind and professional, and I respect your role. But I would not have written that in the school report. I'm thinking about what can we do right now? What do we have liability for? And all this stuff. But outside, I really am asking myself, if I were this kid's parent, what do I want to know? And I think that's a way that helps me in the recommendations in private practice is I ask that question directly to parents. What do you want to know? When you're done with this, what questions will I have answered for you? And then that kind of guides me. So I have yet to recommend anything in regards to medication. That's not an area that a lot of LEPs are trained in. So I would not put in, like, you should take this medication. I might say you should consult with your pediatrician to discuss, potential options for medication. But just keep in mind, again, if you are listening to this, do everything you can to stay within your scope. And if you might have that thought, but you got to make sure you have that knowledge and training too. So, but again, I would have never even written that statement that I said, right? Hey, go to your pediatrician and talk about this. Medication is taboo in the schools to talk about, right? We all think it's like this underlying current in some meetings of, have you possibly considered taking this document to your medical provider and listening to what they suggest, right? We have all these ways that we say it, but in
Right.
this setting, it can be, I think you need to talk to them about medication if that's something you're open to. It's just
Mhm.
the doors are just more open for those transparent words that we're all thinking. So those are some ways that they've opened up. They're a little more flexible, a little more fluid with always considering kind of what my scope is.
Well, you've alluded to a couple of them. What have been some challenges that you did face when you transitioned from school psychologist in the school setting to being an LEP? Kind of along the way, what advice would you give to someone who's kind of considering a similar path?
Yeah, when I saw this question, I really tried to think about it because I have so many things that someone should do, or do differently than I did, I should say. I think the big one is to be okay not knowing all the things. I'm really not good at that, to be really honest with everybody. Like, I don't need to know everything about everything, but I want to know, like, how to do something and that I want to know, like, that I'm going to be okay and that I didn't do it all wrong. And, those are all the thoughts that live in my mind. And that made this hard. And it
Mm.
still is hard because of that, because each opportunity is something I've never done before or I haven't done often. And I was reflecting on this with a colleague. I was talking to her and I was like, man, every situation is new and scary. And I don't always love that feeling. And that's not how I felt about the school setting when I was in it. But then I thought really hard and I'm like, that's not true. I felt that way for years when I started. It just wore off because you practice the skill so much.
Mm.
So remember that when you're trying this new thing, that's exactly what it is. It's a new thing and you don't know because you've not done it. And that's what is supposed to happen, right? You're doing this new thing because it's new, and because it's new, you're not going to know. So be ready and comfortable with that. You don't have to love it, but just be ready to embrace. Another thing is about time. And that's something that I still struggle with because I mentioned, the pros and cons of the school. The school day goes from 7:30 to 3:30 and then you're done. Now, of course, we write reports and check emails and things like that. And that's a journey for us in the schools as we go through and navigate that balance. In the private practice world, it's almost like at first I was like, wow, like I could see a client at night. I could see a client on the weekend. I could do all this stuff. And you can, and maybe you will. And maybe that's what works best for you. But don't fall into the trap of every hour is now available, because
Mm.
having that the distinction is still important of, even if it's a day, right? Even if it's, oh, I don't work on the weekends, or maybe you want to do stuff on the weekends, but then you don't want to be doing stuff for your LEP in the week, right?
Right.
Having some kind of separation doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be, it's never going to be perfect, but having something, because otherwise it feels like every moment is a moment that you should be using. And that's not true either, because you need to be using some of your time for yourself. A lot of us, that's why we made this change, is to be able to take care of ourselves differently or navigate a situation in our life differently. So just kind of figuring out that balance for you. I don't think there's a perfect, it's going to look different for everybody. Like there's no perfect answer to that. And it will likely change for you over time. But making sure you have that in your head of, okay, I'm going to figure out some kind of balance, some kind of time frame, something to put some parameters on it.
I love that. I know you air quoted the word balance. I know you
Yes.
and I have talked about that word. I tend to love the word harmony,
Yeah.
just with the idea that just like in the school psychology world, there may be times, there may be some seasons of the year where we maybe are okay with bringing things home,
Yeah.
a little bit more often, but that isn't something we want to do all the time. And I think talking with you and talking with other LEPs, sometimes you can't space out everything. And there is an influx of things all of a sudden. And then there's some barren land up ahead where we're not getting something,
Yeah.
as many cases coming our way. And so, kind of navigating that can also
Mm.
be, I think, a challenge. Whereas in the school setting, I think most of the time, like we don't spend time marketing ourselves because
Oh
everyone
my
just keeps
gosh.
coming
Yeah.
to us.
We don't need to. Yes. Where everyone's best friend in the school setting. And while you were chatting, Jenny, you mentioned kind of that it's hard to sometimes space things out and all of that. And it got me thinking, one of the things I did in the very beginning was I got myself an office space. And I intentionally, this might scare some people, but so in the district, I had my own district laptop. That's how I did everything. And then when I left the district, of course, that's their item. So I gave that laptop back. And I intentionally did not buy another laptop. I bought a desktop to go in my office. And I did that on purpose because I wanted to try to train myself that I don't need to be opening up my laptop at home at night doing all this work. I need to be able to come to my office and work. And I tried to create some kind of like physical barriers too. It's worked okay. It's not perfect. I have to be honest, but I did, there are these efforts that you can try to make to like create this setting that's going to work the best for you. Now, in those moments where you have the influx, I'm
Yeah.
like, oh man, give me a laptop. I'll type on my phone. I'll do whatever I need to. I'll write it out. I'll write it out on a piece of paper. Like there are times when there is truly a need, or you're traveling, or you're whatever you're doing. So it's just an idea, just something to consider for folks. And it's something that I wish I had that in the schools, because we always had our laptops with us, right? You could open it up at 2 a.m. when you couldn't sleep because you're worried about this kid that you're testing, and you could work on stuff. So it's just a way that I tried to keep that distinction too.
Well, how has your perspective on working with students and schools? Have you noticed any changes after starting your own private practice?
Yeah, mostly about my own practice as a school psychologist. I wish I leaned into parents more when I was a school psychologist. I think, again, I know at the beginning I was mentioning that for me, it was this kind of perfect storm. Like I had my own child, and my perspective naturally changed that way as well. But in private practice, you don't have your, ed specialist that you can just walk down the hall and talk to, or your SLP. It's you. So the person that you naturally get a lot of information from tends to be the parent.
Yeah.
And I have found that it's such a wealth of information. They might be frustrated, they might be defeated, they might be sad, they might be all the things that we're not comfortable with in the school setting, right? At least for me, I wasn't. I don't want to make a parent sad, right? That's never my goal. But they are feeling that way because there's something that they want to know. There's a hole, there's a gap. And if you can make yourself seen as somebody who can help fill that gap, really truly be a collaborator. We all talk about homeschool collaboration, but we can really be a facilitator of that just for ourselves. I wish I did that more. And I learned so much now from parents. And I think some of it in the school setting is we do have so much going on. We have so many open assessments. We have such little time in the day that scheduling an hour and a half long interview with a parent is not always feasible for every single case. But I think even just calling and introducing yourself, just that little step, that to be honest, there were so many cases where I just emailed, sent my form, said who I was, and there is nothing wrong with that either. But I think it does not allow you the same opportunity for them to hear your voice, to get a sense of your personality. You might not want them to have your direct school number or whatever, but maybe you do, and maybe that's helpful. So it's these little tiny things that really just build a connection. And now that I'm out here and I do some of the IEE work, a lot of that's coming from a broken connection. And so I think that there are things that we could be doing to maybe avoid some of those broken connections that would in turn make your IEPs run smoother, develop more trust. So that's just something I wish I would have done differently previously that I think, or I would hope I would do differently now if I went back to the schools, if time allowed. And I think the time piece is a big factor for people too.
This has been a great conversation, and we're just getting started. We'll continue this discussion in next week's episode, so be sure to subscribe now so you don't miss part 2. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to having you join us next time. That concludes another episode of the Prepared School Psych podcast, and I hope today's discussion equipped you not just with knowledge, but also the confidence to take action. Remember, every conversation we have and every resource we share builds a bridge towards a more inclusive and empowering learning landscape for our students. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more insightful conversations and resources to support your journey. Share this podcast with colleagues. We would love it if you would also rate and review the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Just a reminder, everyone, the information and advice provided in this podcast are for guidance purposes only, and all listeners are required to follow both federal and state law and their own school district guidelines and policies. Thank you.